The Soviet Union's OKB-1 design bureau began with 4 Vostok 1K prototypes. Each was tested with 2 dogs as pilots. 4 canine cosmonauts were lost, but the craft continued development. In 1961, 2 Vostok 3KA spacecrafts carried single dogs into orbit. The crafts performed much better this time, and both missions went off without a hitch. The Vostok was ready for human cargo. On April 12th of 1961, Yuri Gagarin becomes the first man in space. Once again, Russia was proudly a step ahead of their American competitors, but that wouldn't be grounds for them to err on the side of caution.
On November 28, 1966, the first unmanned launch of a new prototype began, codenamed Cosmos 133. During the test launch, the spacecraft flew into orbit, but malfunctioned repeatedly. Its model was eventually named Soyuz 7K OK, the first generation of Soyuz spacecraft.
On April 23rd of 1967, Vladimir Komarov became the first man to die during a mission. The Soyuz 1 capsule had made it into orbit, where it was supposed to dock with another Soyuz that would be launched later, a monumental feat and just in time for the 50th anniversary of the Communist Revolution. Once in orbit, however, Soyuz 1 began to suffer extensive malfunctions. First, one of the capsule's 2 solar panel arrays failed to deploy. With only half the input it was built for, the craft struggled to sustain its more intensive systems, namely those of heating, navigation, and communication. The ground crew desperately searched for ways to help Komarov regain control of his vessel and return safely. After more than 24 hours and 18 orbits, Soyuz 1 finally began atmospheric re-entry. As it plummeted, however, the main parachute failed to deploy, and so did the backup. Their housings had been damaged by the pressure difference between the Soyuz cabin and the vacuum of space, a fault engineers were unable to detect in testing due to their brutally limited time and resources, mandated by the desire of Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev to complete the mission by the impending anniversary. Only the drogue chute had been deployed, leaving Komarov with no way to bleed off speed. It shouldn't have been a surprise for anyone. Komarov himself knew from the beginning that he would most likely die. In fact, he had agreed to be the pilot only because he knew that if he refused, he would be replaced by his dear friend Yuri Gagarin, and the mission would continue on without a second thought. Gagarin was actually on the engineering team that inspected the capsule and found more than 200 design flaws, not even counting the parachute housing issue, which resulted in Komarov's death. Ultimately, achieving another monumental mission by the impending anniversary was more important to Soviet leadership than the safety and integrity of said mission.
Early on, it really was a lot about national prestige.
Earlier that year, on January 27, 1967, the crew of Apollo 1 cooked in the capsule during a testing ground. A fire began inside the spacecraft, causing the exit hatch to seal due to heat and pressure, preventing the underprepared ground crew from getting to the astronauts in time. Due to a lack of scrutiny under pressures to beat the Soviet Union to the moon, NASA failed to realize how the combination of pure oxygen capsule atmosphere and unchecked interior flammability would create fantastic kindling. The space race was heating up, and a pattern of sacrificing caution for speed was beginning to manifest.
On October 30th of 1967, Cosmos 186 and 188 met in orbit and partially docked. Both were unmanned crafts intended to test new tweaks and get the Soyuz program back on its feet. Interestingly enough, the crafts were on the opposite side of the world from Russia when they docked. Once they came back into observable range, it turns out that the crafts had been moving too quickly relative to each other, and the docking ports were damaged, making a proper seal impossible. Nevertheless, they had docked, and the docking was historic. Certainly a step forward for Soyuz, even if it was a hasty one.
1969, Apollo 11. An Event of Moon Disaster was the title of 2 short pages written by President Nixon's speechwriter, William Safire, on July 18, 1969, just in case the astronauts of Apollo 11 met their fates on the lunar surface. This letter would direct the higher offices of the U.S. government to how to address the world regarding the disaster. Unfortunately, it was never necessary. This does, however, demonstrate a part of the U.S. attitude regarding lives lost in space, potentially or otherwise. This degree of caution seems to starkly contrast that of NASA's Russian counterpart, but already both nations had experienced the consequences of rushing rocket science and would continue to do so, whether they took political precautions or not.
2 years later, in June of 1971, a mission somewhat ironically designated Soyuz 11 would result in the first lives lost in space. The fully loaded Soyuz 7K OK, carrying 3 cosmonauts, depressurized during re-entry above the Kármán line. The vacuum quickly claimed all 3 lives.
Consequently, in July of the next year, Cosmos 496 only sported 2 seats, both empty, and the third one was replaced with backup life support systems. This mission launched and landed successfully, replacing the Soyuz 7K OK with the Soyuz 7K T. The Soyuz had taken a step in a new direction, not to be slower, but certainly more steady.
By April of 1975, times were changing.
Early on, there was no thought of cooperative effort, at least in manned flight, with the Russians.
And soon the United States and Russia would participate in their first cooperative mission, making history, warming the Cold War, and gesturing towards an end to the space race. Unfortunately, the reliability of such an endeavor was called into question when Soyuz 18A, a mission to the Soyuz station, was cut short. During ascent, faulty pyrotechnic charges failed to separate the first stage from the second. Eventually, the second stage engine managed to destroy the remaining connections to the lower stage, allowing the upper stage to escape, but this ordeal had set the craft off course. Onboard gyroscopes detected the deviation and triggered the abort, allowing the crew to escape safely. The next flight, Soyuz 18B, would successfully deliver its cosmonauts to Salyut, but there was another conflict. This mission would overlap that of Apollo-Soyuz, so the Russians would be communicating with both their space station and the Soyuz, which was participating in the joint mission. According to the CIA, this could be a scramble for the Russians. In light of this, Senator William Proxmire of Wisconsin cited CIA data which indicated that the communication capabilities of the Soviet space program were inferior to the US, potentially not adequate for the upcoming Apollo-Soyuz mission, he argued. But alas, in July of 1975, both Apollo-Soyuz and Soyuz 18B would go off without a hitch. Despite the lack of tragedy, politics had finally taken a cautionary step backwards for once.
In September of 1983, the Soyuz would once again demonstrate its increasingly remarkable ability to escape the jaws of death. Soyuz T-10A was on the launch pad when a valve fueling the A-2 beneath it failed to close properly, drenching the launch pad in volatile rocket fuel, which promptly caught fire. The fire quickly spread and burned through the systems, which would have triggered an automatic abort, and with no manual abort available to the cosmonauts, this left only the ground crew to trigger the abort. Despite these convoluted anti-sabotage measures, the Soyuz T-10A capsule was ejected and flew its cosmonauts to safety mere seconds before the A-2 detonated.
Soyuz 18A and T-10A demonstrated that after many challenging years and tragic failures, the Soyuz and its engineers had come out on top. Enough time had passed, enough tests finally accumulated, that the Soyuz project had more or less made up for all the crucial testing and resources it had missed out on earlier in development.
In light of this, an interesting juxtaposition can be made between the Soyuz and the many projects of NASA over the years. As presidents changed, so did the mission of NASA.
Kennedy told them to go to the moon, Nixon told them to develop a shuttle as he cut their budget, Carter prioritized reconnaissance satellites.
Meanwhile, Soyuz remained the flag bearer of Russian rocketry, ultimately meaning that while each new mission of NASA got only a presidency or two during which it could be pursued, Soyuz had developmental attention from the beginning of the space race all the way into today.
The result? Soyuz is not only the most reliable human space transport of today, but it is the only human space transport of today.
The Soyuz program was developed in the 60s, and yet it's still going now. We're, 2019.
Clearly, the moral of the story is that time and care make functional rockets, while political flexes and strict timelines do not.